Hello, today I'm going to tell you the story of the most unfortunate disasters in history. Immerse yourself and drift off to leap peacefully peep in the year 540-41 CE. A disease arrived in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium that would kill within a decade, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. Roughly a quarter to half of the entire population of the Byzantine Empire and its neighbors. It was the first recorded pandemic in human history. We know it today as the Plague of Justinian, named for the emperor who survived it barely, and who was in many ways its most consequential victim. Not because he died, but because the disease destroyed the world he had spent his reign trying to rebuild. The pathogen was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would return 6 centuries later as the Black Death. It was carried by fleas living on black rats, and those rats traveled on the grain ships that connected Egypt to Constantinople, North Africa to Italy, the Mediterranean world to itself. When the plague reached Constantinople in 542, the city was at the height of its power. Just completed the reconquest of North Africa from the Vandals, and was in the middle of his great campaign to retake Italy from the Ostrogoths. The Hagia Sophia had recently been completed. The great legal codification, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was finished. Constantinople was the most magnificent city in the Christian world to perhaps 500,000 people, and it was about to experience something unprecedented. The Byzantine court historian Procopius, who witnessed the plague in Constantinople firsthand, left a description that remains one of the most vivid accounts of epidemic disease in ancient or medieval literature. He wrote that the sickness began with fever, a mild fever that gave little warning of what was to follow. Within days, swellings appeared in the groin, the armpits, or behind the ears. The telltale buboes of bubonic plague, hard lumps beneath the skin that could grow to the size of an apple. Some victims fell into comas and could not be roused. Others were seized by violent delusions, throwing themselves from upper windows or running into the streets. Death followed in most cases within 3 to 7 days. Procopius estimated at the height of the epidemic in Constantinople, 10,000 people were dying every day. Modern historians regard this figure as an exaggeration, but the scale of mortality was genuinely overwhelming. The logistical consequences of mass death at this scale were themselves catastrophic. The dead piled up faster than the living could bury them. Justinian appointed a court official named Theodoros to organize the disposal of bodies. Ships were loaded with corpses and sunk the sea, and towers at the city's fortifications were opened, built with bodies, and sealed. The smell of death was present everywhere in the city for weeks. Economic life collapsed. Closed when harvested, because there were no workers to tend them. The grain supply faltered because the ships that carried it were crewed by men who were dying. The military campaigns in Italy and Persia were disrupted as soldiers and their commanders succumbed. The tax revenues on which Justinian's ambitious projects depended evaporated. Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived. One of the lucky minority who experienced an agut. The empire he had worked so hard to restore never fully recovered with him. The reconquests in the West, Italy, North Africa, parts of Spain, proved impossible to hold with the depleted population and dwindling revenues. Within a generation of Justinian's death, in 565, much of what he had retaken was lost again. The plague returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, each outbreak further reducing the population and weakening the empire's capacity to defend its borders. When the armies of Islam emerged from Arabia in the 630s and up to cross the nearest east and a ninth speed, they were in part conquering a world that the plague of Justinian had already hollowed out. The first pandemic of history shaped the geopolitics of the medieval world before the medieval world had properly begun. Part 3. The volcanic winter and the famine of 536. The worst year in human history. Before the plague of Justinian arrived, the 6th century already dealt the world a blow of staggering proportions. In the year 530 CE, a catastrophe began that medieval scholar and science writer Mac O'Cormac has called, after extensive study of the evidence, the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. The cause was a volcanic eruption, or possibly 2 or 3 eruptions, in close succession, somewhere in the northern hemisphere, most probably in Iceland or North America. The precise source remains a subject of scientific investigation, but the effects are documented across the globe in tree rings, ice cores, and contemporary written sources with unusual consistency. The eruption or eruptions injected enormous quantities of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, where they circulated around the globe and reflected sunlight back into space. The result was a sustained dimming of the sun that lasted 18 months. Contemporary sources from Ireland to China to the Byzantine Empire record the same phenomenon. A dry fog that reduced sunlight. A sun, bleared, bluish or pale as if its fire had been partially extinguished. Crops that failed run because the summer temperatures were too cold. The Byzantine historian Procopius, the same chronicler who would later describe the plague, wrote that in 536 the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, throughout the whole year. He called it a sign of something terrible to come. The agricultural consequences were immediate and severe. Across much of the northern hemisphere, the growing season shortened dramatically. Crops failed across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East. The price of grain rose steeply. In the weakened communities that followed the famine, epidemic disease found easier purchase. Ireland's chronicles crawlered. A failure of bread, a failure of bricks, and 536, and 539, Tring 539. Tree ring data from Scandinavia to Siberia shows some of the narrowest growth rings of the past 2 millennia clustered around 36 to 536 to 545. Contemporaries who did not know the cause knew the effect. Food was scarce, people were dying, and the sky itself seemed to have withdrawn its favor from the human world. The famine of 536 ends years that followed contributed directly to the demographic weakness that made the plague of Justinian so devastating when it arrived in 541. A population already stressed by years of reduced harvests and food insecurity was in no condition to resist a new pathogen. The double blow, volcanic winter followed by pandemic, created what historians now recognize as a period of severe depopulation and economic contraction across the Mediterranean world, and beyond that lasted for over a century. The Late Antique Little Ice Age, as climate scientists have named it, persisted from roughly 530-36 to 666 CE, fundamentally shaping the political and economic landscape of the early medieval world and contributing to the decline of several major civilizations, including the Sasanian Persian Empire and the weakening of the Byzantine state. Part 4. The Great Famine of 1515 to Winnington 1522, when Europe starved. 7 centuries after the volcanic winter of 536. A different kind of climatic catastrophe struck medieval Europe. The medieval warm period, a centuries-long phase of relatively mild and stable climate that had allowed population growth, agricultural expansion, and the great building projects of the High Middle Ages, was ending. In its place came the beginning of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a long-term cooling of the northern hemisphere that would bring centuries of colder, wetter, and more unstable weather. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was first and most devastating expression of this climatic transition. It began with rain. In the spring and summer of 1315, an unusual weather pattern brought persistent, heavy rainfall across much of northern Europe, England, France, the Low Countries, Germany, Scandinavia, and Poland. The rain did not stop at the end of summer. It continued through the autumn, preventing the harvest from ripening and rotting what had already been cut. The winter followed was severe. When spring came in 1316, it brought more rain. The cycle repeated for 7 consecutive years, with brief and insufficient intervals of better weather, raised hopes only to dash them again. The harvests of 1315 through 322 were the worst sustained agricultural failure in European history. To that point, the human consequences unfolded with terrible logic. As grain stocks, brooks ran low, prices, the levels that the poor, the majority of the medieval population, could not afford. In England, the price of wheat rose to 6 times its normal level at the height of the famine. People ate whatever they could find: grass, bark, roots, cats, dogs, and in some documented cases, the bodies of the dead. Temporary chronicles from across northern Europe describe scenes of mass starvation that their authors struggled to comprehend. The Chronicle of the Abbey of St. Martin in Tournai records that the poor lay in the streets, that bodies blocked passage through the city gates. An estimated 10 to 15% of the population of northern Europe in the Great Famine, somewhere between 3 and 7 million people, in a region that probably held between 30 and 50 million, Livestock were not spared. Cattle disease, murrain, struck the herds of England and northern Europe simultaneously with the famine years, killing enormous numbers of animals. The combination of grain failure and livestock death was particularly devastating. Draft animals' died, reducing the capacity to plow. Dairy cattle died, removing another food source. Wool-producing sheep died, collapsing in an important element of the textile economy. The economy, medieval England was so disrupted that it took generations to recover fully. The demographic impact of the famine, the deaths, the reduced birth rates among starving populations, the increased vulnerability to disease, left communities smaller and weaker, just as an even greater catastrophe was taking shape in Central Asia. The Great Famine also had significant political consequences. Governments that could not feed their populations faced legitimacy crises. In France, the reign of Philip V was destabilized by famine-related unrest. In England, the difficulties of the famine years into the baronial conflicts and political instability of Edward's reign, culminating in his deposition in 1227. The famine accelerated the collapse of the last Crusader states in the Holy Land, as the resources that have supported millet campaigns were absorbed entirely by the crisis at home, and it left in its wake a population weakened. Then the next catastrophe would, with devastating efficiency. The Great Famine did not cause the Black Death, but it prepared the ground for it. Part 5 of The Black Death, the greatest catastrophe in history in 33347, 13353. In October 33477, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors on board dying? They had brought with them, from the ports of the Black Sea, a cargo that no one had ordered and no one could return. The most lethal pathogen in recorded human history. By the time the harbor masters of Messina ordered the ships back out sea, it was already too late. Within weeks, the disease was in Sicily. Within months, it was across Italy. Within 3 years, it had swept from Iceland to India, and between 75 and 200 million people. Estimates vary enormously. Even then, the most conservative figures are staggering. Were dead. The Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that had driven the plague of Justinian 8 centuries earlier. But the 14th century pandemic was far more deadly, in part because it struck a population that had no inherited immunity from that earlier outbreak, in part because medieval Europe's dense urban populations and active trade networks provided the pathogen with ideal conditions for rapid spread, and in part because the disease appears to have taken multiple forms. Bubonic plague, spread by flea bites, produced the characteristic swellings and killed most of its victims. Pneumonic plague, spread by respiratory droplets, was almost universally fatal and spread even more quickly. Septicemic plague, in which the infection reached the bloodstream directly, killed so fast that victims sometimes went to bed healthy and were dead by morning. The course of the pandemic across Europe is documented in extraordinary detail in medieval chronicles, notarial records, wills, and municipal accounts. A paper trail of death that allows historians to trace the disease's movement, almost day by day. It arrived in Marseille in January through 48, in Paris by June, in England by the autumn, in Scandinavia and Poland by 1350. In Florence, the most documented city of the 14th century, the population fell foul from approximately 100,000 before the plague to perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 in its aftermath. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the epidemic in Florence and whose Decameron is framed by the social collapse of the plague, described streets filled with bodies, the abandonment of the sick by their own families, the complete breakdown of social norms in the face of universal terror. One man shunned another, he wrote. Neighbors made no effort to help neighbors. Kinsfolk held aloof. Brother was forsaken by brother. Mortality across Europe was staggering and unevenly distributed. Some regions lost 30% of their population. Others lost 60 or 70%. England lost approximately half its population between 348 and 348 and 350. And demographic catastrophe from which the country would not recover to its pre-plague population for more than a century and a half. France lost comparable proportions. The Italian cities, where the disease spread most explosively in the densely packed urban environment, suffered some of the highest mortality rates. In the village of Givry in Burgundy, whose parish records survive, the number of burials in 1348 was 10 times higher than in a normal year. At Norwich, one of England's largest cities, an estimated 60% of the population died. The scale of the loss is almost impossible to comprehend even now. The social consequences of the Black Death were as revolutionary as its demographic impact. The labor shortage created by the death of so large a fraction of the working population transformed the economic and social relationships of European feudalism. Surviving peasants found that their labor was suddenly scarce and therefore valuable. They demanded higher wages, better conditions, the relaxation of feudal obligations that had bound them to the land and to their lords for generations. When lords refused these demands, or when governments attempted to legislate wages back to their pre-plague levels, as the English Statute of Laborers of 1351 tried to do, the result was unrest, resistance, and eventually outright rebellion. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie 1358, and similar uprisings across Europe in the second half of the 14th century were not simply caused by the plague. But the plague's redistribution of labor and economic power was a fundamental driver of the social tensions that possible. The Black Death did not end feudalism, but it set in motion the processes that would eventually do so. The religious and psychological consequences were equally profound. The Church, which was expected to explain and manage suffering of this kind, found itself as helpless as everyone else, its priests dying alongside their parishioners, its theology unable to explain why God would permit such indiscriminate death of the innocent and the guilty alike. The decades that followed the Black Death saw a surge in mystical religion, in apocalyptic thinking, in the flagellant movement, groups of people who processed from town to town, flogging themselves in public penance, hoping to appease a God they believed had sent the plague as punishment for human sin. They also saw an intensification of anti-Semitism. Across Germany, France, and other parts of Europe, Jewish communities were massacred by populations who blamed them for poisoning the wells. These atrocities, for which there was not a shred of evidence, among the darkest chapters of medieval religious. The Black Death did not create an anti-Semitism, but it provided a pretext for its most organized and lethal expressions. Ends Part 6. The Mongol Conquests, the Storm from the East, 100 Thund to Su-Sayers 6 and Tindame 368. Before the Black Death came, another catastrophe had reshaped the world. One made not of disease, but of deliberate, organized, and extraordinarily efficient violence. Into to add 6. A Mongol chieftain named proclaimed Genghis Khan universal ruler by an assembly of the nomadic tribes of the Central Asian steppe. With 2 decades, he and his generals had created the largest land empire in history to that point, stretching from China to Persia. Within a century of his death, his descendants had conquered China, Korea, Central Asia, Persia, much of the Middle East, Russia, Poland, and Hungary. The human cost of these conquests was, by the most serious scholarly estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40 million dead. Proportionally, one of the largest reductions of the human population in history. The Mongol military system was built on speed, coordination, and calculated use of terror. Mongol armies were almost entirely cavalry. Fast-moving, expert archers, capable of shooting with lethal accuracy from horseback at full gallop. They communicated across vast distances using relay riders who could pass messages hundreds of miles in a day. They used complex tactical deceptions, false retreats designed to draw enemy forces into ambushes, and pesticist-seeded siege technology learned from Chinese and Persian engineers against the armies of medieval Europe and the Islamic world, accustomed to slower-moving forces and different tactical assumptions. The Mongols were almost invariably victorious. The policy of terror was not incidental, but calculated. Cities that submitted peacefully were generally spared and incorporated into Mongol administrative system. Cities that resisted were destroyed comprehensively. The population killed, the buildings leveled, the irrigation systems broken, sometimes literally so. The canals that sustained agriculture in Mesopotamia and Entralea were deliberately destroyed in some cases, turning productive agricultural land into desert. The effect was intended to convince the next city that resistance was futile. It worked with devastating effectiveness, but it also meant that entire civilizations were erased. The Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, one of the most sophisticated Islamic civilizations of the medieval period, was completely destroyed in a campaign to 1219 and 120 and 221. The great cities of Samarkand, Nishapur, Merv, and Herat were sacked and their populations massacred. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that Nishapur, once a city of perhaps 200,000 people, was left with so few survivors that it effectively ceased to exist as a major urban center for generations. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 was perhaps the single most consequential act of the Mongol conquests in terms of cultural and civilizational loss. Baghdad was the capital of Basid Caliphate, the spiritual and political center of the Sunni Muslim world, and for 5 centuries, one of the greatest cities of learning in the medieval world. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, had been the world's premier center of scholarship, preserving and translating the scientific and philosophical works of ancient Greece, Persia, and India, and producing original advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. When the Mongol forces of Hulagu Khan besieged and then sacked Baghdad over 2 weeks in February 258, the result was catastrophic. Caliph al-Mustasim was killed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses so that his royal blood would not touch the ground. Estimates of the dead range from 90,000 to 1 million. Modern historians generally believe the true figure was somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. The city's libraries were looted or burned, and an Arab chronicler wrote that the waters of the Tigris ran black with ink from the submerged books and red with the blood of the slain. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had lasted more than 5 centuries, ended that week. It never recovered. The Mongol conquests also played a decisive role in the spread of the Black Death. The trade networks the Mongol Empire established across Eurasia, the Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability and open trade characterized the empire at its height, allowed goods, people, and pathogens to move across the continent with unprecedented speed. The plague that reached the Crimean port of Kaffa in 1346, which Genoese merchants then carried to Messina in 1347, had traveled along the very trade routes that the Mongols had created. The destroyers of civilizations had, with macabre irony, also the highway along and the most destructive disease in history traveled to its appointment with humanity. Parts and then the 100 Years' War at Devastation, a century of fire and ruin, Atum Freon 37-17-1453. The 100 Years' War between England and France was not a single conflict, but a series interconnected wars, truces, and renewed hostilities that stretched across more than a century and devastated large parts what is now France. It began in 1337 over a dispute about succession to the French throne. Edward III of England claimed the crown of France through his mother, and it ended in 453 with the final expulsion of English forces from French soil, leaving only Calais in English hands. In between lay 116 years of warfare, combined with the Black Death and the Great Famine. The 14th and early 15th centuries, one of the most catastrophic periods in French history. The great English victories of the war, Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Gincourt in 1450, Agincourt in 1450, have passed into legend, celebrated in English history and in literature as demonstrations of martial glory. But the experience of the battles from the French side, and above all the experience of the French civilian population, across a century of warfare, was one of sustained devastation. English military strategy in France relied heavily on the chevauchée, a deliberate campaign of destruction in which armies moved through the countryside burning crops, killing livestock, destroying mills and farm buildings, and terrorizing the rural population. The purpose was economic and psychological. Deprive the French crown of revenue and to demonstrate its inability to protect its own subjects. The effect was to reduce large areas of rural France to waste. The situation was made catastrophically worse by the emergence of the routiers, bands of disbanded soldiers from all sides of the conflict, who, when formal military campaigns paused during truces, continued to operate as armed gangs, extracting money from villages and towns by threat of violence and extortion. These companies of freelances, as they were called, were a permanent feature of the 100 Years' War landscape, descending on communities that had nothing to give, burning what they could not take, and disappearing before any organized military response could be mounted. Contemporary French sources describe villages emptied by a combination of plague, famine, and the terror of the routiers, communities where the fields went untilled because the farmers had fled or died, where churches stood roofless and ruined, where wolves moved through streets that had once been with life. The political crisis of France in the early 15th century added civil war to external warfare. The rivalry between the Burgundian and Armagnac factions, competing aristocratic parties that claimed to speak for the interests of the unstable, intermittently mad King Charles II, tore the country apart from within even as the English pressed their advantage from without. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, by which the mentally incapacitated Charles V agreed that Henry V of England would be his heir and the French throne would to the English crown. English crown represented the nadir of French national existence. A kingdom that had been at war for 80 years was now formally annexed by its enemy. That France recovered at all from this position, that it eventually expelled the English, rebuilt its institutions, and emerged as one of the most powerful states in Europe, is a testament to human resilience. But the cost of that recovery, measured in lives, in destroyed communities, in economic regression, and in the trauma of generations, was almost incalculable. Into this catastrophe stepped one of the most extraordinary figures in medieval history, Joan of Arc, a young woman from the village of Domremy in northeastern France. She heard voices she believed were those of saints commanding her drive the English from France and see the dauphin crowned king In 1429, at the age of approximately 17, she was granted an audience with Charles Sat, convinced him of her mission, was given armor and an army, and led French forces to a series of victories that broke the English siege of Orléans and turned the military tide of the war. She was captured by the Burgundians in Fornthian, 1030, sold to the English, tried by a church court for heresy and witchcraft, and burned at the stake in Rouen en Fonthian 1031, at the age of approximately 19. 25 years later, after France had won the war she had helped to turn, a posthumous retrial cleared her of all charges. She was canonized as a saint in 1920. Her story is inseparable from the catastrophe of the 100 Years' War, a catastrophe that produced, as catastrophes sometimes do, a human response of such extraordinary character that it defies ordinary explanation. Part 8. The Fall of Constantinople, the End of the Roman World. Fun 453. On May 29, 453, something that the people of Constantinople had believed structurally impossible finally happened. The city fell, the new Rome, the city that Constantine that founded in 3030 CE as the eternal capital of the Christian Roman Empire. The city that had survived sieges by Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Russians. The city whose walls had protected civilization itself through centuries of turbulence was breached, and the last emperor of Rome died in the fight at its walls. What it ended that morning was not merely a city or a dynasty. It was a civilization that had sustained itself for more than 1,000 years. The Ottomans Sultan Mehmed II, who had laid siege to Constantinople with an army that contemporaries estimated at between 80,000 and 2,200,000 men, against a defending force, perhaps 7,000, was 21 years old and already recognized as one of the most formidable military minds of his age. He had prepared for this siege with meticulous care. He had commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to cast the largest cannons that the world had yet seen, bronze monsters capable of hurling balling stone balls weighing 600 pounds against the ancient walls of the city. He had constructed a naval chain across the Golden Horn and had ships transported overland on greased rollers to bypass it. He had studied the city's defenses with the same systematic intents he brought to every campaign. Emperor Constantine Z. Palaiologos, who defended the city, did so with full knowledge that relief was not coming. He had sent ambassadors to the courts of Western Europe for years, warning of the Ottoman threat and begging for military assistance. The response had been inadequate. Few hundred Genoese volunteers, a small Venetian naval contingent, and promises that never materialized into armies. The theological dispute between the Catholic West and the Orthodox, deepened by the failed Union of Florence in 1139, which had tried to reunify the two churches in exchange for Western military support, meant that many Byzantines themselves rejected the compromise, preferring to lose their city to the Ottoman Turks than to compromise their faith to the Latin Christians. Better the turban of the Sultan than the cardinals had of Rome. A Byzantine official was said to have declared, "The city's fall was as much a product of the divisions of Christendom of Ottoman military power." The siege lasted 53 days. Mehmed's cannons battered the ancient walls continuously, creating breaches that the defenders filled at night with improvised barriers. The Ottoman infantry launched assault after assault that the tiny garrison, supplemented desperate civilian volunteers, managed to repel. On the final night, Constantine C's reportedly received communion, asked forgiveness of all who had wronged him, and took his place at the most vulnerable section of the wall. When the Ottomans broke through in the early hours of May 29th, the emperor reportedly threw off his imperial insignia and fought till he was killed. Though his body was never definitively identified, in the carnage that followed, the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Pope Nicholas II called for a crusade that never materialized. Humanist scholars across Europe wrote lamentations comparing the loss to the fall of Troy. Greek scholars who fled the city carried with them manuscripts of ancient Greek literature and philosophy that would fuel the Renaissance and transform the intellectual life of Europe. But beyond these cultural consequences, the fall of Constantinople had profound geopolitical implications. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the primary land route between Europe and Asia, and its ability to tax and disrupt the eastern trade routes contributed to the European search for alternative sea routes to Asia. A search that would, within decades, lead to Columbus's voyage to the Americas and Vasco's rounding of Africa. The fall of a medieval city contributed, by this indirect but traceable chain of consequences, to the beginning of European global expansion. Catastrophe, as always, remade the world in it the world's own image. Part 9. The Children's Crusade and the Disasters of Holy Violence and the Road to Ruin. The Crusades were one of the defining enterprises of the medieval world. A series of military expeditions launched by Western Christian powers between 1095 and 1091, with the declared purpose of recovering Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. They were also, from multiple perspectives, among the most catastrophic series of events in medieval history. Catastrophic for the Muslim and Jewish populations, on whose lives crusading violence falls most heavily. Catastrophic for the Byzantine Empire, whose territory was ravaged by crusading armies passing through, and catastrophic in many cases for the crusaders themselves, who died in enormous numbers from disease, starvation, military defeat, and the consequences of their own strategic miscalculations. The First Crusade, launched in 1096 by Pope Urban II, by a popular movement known to history as the People's Crusade. A mass of ordinary people, largely untrained and unequipped for warfare, who set out across Europe and Anatolia following a preacher named for the Hermit. Before they even left Christian territory, bands associated with this movement attacked and massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland cities of Worms, Worms, Mayence, and Cologne, killing several thousand people in what are known as the Rhineland massacres of Uns in 96. These were among the worst episodes of anti-Semitic violence in medieval European history to that point. And they established a pattern of associating crusading enthusiasm with violence against Jewish communities that recur throughout the crusading period. The People's Crusade itself was annihilated by Turkish forces in Anatolia, almost without military resistance. The Children's Crusade of Ponthieu-Valve remains the most haunting episodes in medieval history. A story of misplaced faith, exploitation, and catastrophe that has been romanticized in later centuries, but that ended, for those involved, in tragedy. In the summer of 112, separate movements arose in France and Germany, each led by a young man, Stephen of Cloyes in France and Nicholas of Cologne in Germany, who claimed divine visions commanding them to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. Thousands of young people and poor adults followed them. Contemporary estimates are unreliable, but the numbers appear to have been in the thousands. The German contingent crossed the Alps into Italy. Many died of heat and exhaustion before reaching the sea. When the sea did not miraculously alert, Nicholas had promised it would, the movement fragmented and most participants made their way home as best they could. The French contingent reached Marseille, where merchants, named Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, the contemptuous nicknames by which they are remembered, offered to provide ships free of charge. 7 ships departed. 2 were wrecked in a storm off Sardinia with all aboard. The remaining 5 reached North Africa, where the passengers were sold into slavery. None of them reached Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 202, represents one of the most extraordinary diversions in the history of military campaigns. A crusade that ended not in Jerusalem, but in the sacking of the greatest Christian city in the world, intended to attack Egypt. The crusading army became entangled in debt to Venice, which had provided the transport ships, and was persuaded to divert first to the Adriatic coast and then to Constantinople, where a succession dispute offered the pretext for intervention. In April 224, the Crusaders, who had sworn to recover the Holy Sepulchre, instead broke through the walls of Constantinople and spent 3 days looting it. The bronze horses of the Hippodrome were shipped to Venice, where they remain to this day above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica. Relics of enormous sacred significance were stolen and dispersed across Western Europe. The greatest Christian city of the medieval world was left plundered, depopulated, and in the hands of Latin lords who held it for 57 years, Brunswick, before Byzantine forces recaptured it. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople did more lasting damage to the cause of Christian unity than any theological dispute. It created a bitterness between Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christians that persisted for centuries. Part 10. The dancing plague and the flagellants, when despair took strange forms. Among the strangest manifestations of medieval catastrophe were the social phenomena it produced. the collective behaviors of populations pushed beyond the limits of what human psychology could absorb alone. Two of the most remarkable of these phenomena were the flagellant movements that swept Europe during and after the Black Death, and the dancing plagues that broke out in various European cities during the late medieval period. Both tell us something profound about what extreme and prolonged suffering does to human communities, how terror and grief can produce behaviors that defy ordinary explanation. The flagellant movement emerged during the Black Death of Thurthorn 347, 13th, as a form of collective penitential response to the pandemic. Flagellants were people who believed that the plague was God's punishment for human sin, and who sought to appease divine wrath through public, ritualized self-mortification. Groups of flagellants, sometimes hundreds strong, would process from town to town, twice daily engaging in ceremonies in which they beat themselves with leather straps studded with iron spikes, drawing blood and demonstrating their willingness to suffer in expiation of sin. Their arrival in a town was an event. Crowds gathered, some overcome with emotion and joining the procession, others weeping at the spectacle. Contemporary accounts from Germany and those countries described the flagellants chanting hymns as they marched and as they whipped themselves. The sound and sight of the proceedings producing intense emotional responses in witnesses. The flagellant movement, which precedents in earlier medieval penitential practice, but never before reached this scale, alarmed the institutional church precisely because it operated outside church control and made implicit claims by suggesting that personal penance of this kind could earn direct divine forgiveness, that challenged the church's role as the necessary intermediary between God and humanity. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in 1349, and it was suppressed by ecclesiastical and secular authorities in most parts of Europe. But the impulse that produced it, the desperate need to do something, anything, in the face of a catastrophe that ordinary human action could not address, is entirely comprehensible as a human response to the experience of watching half pop one nose die in a matter of months. The dancing plagues are, if anything, even in stranger. The most famous occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when a woman named Fratrafia began dancing in a street and could not stop. Within days, dozens of others had joined her. Within a month, the number had grown to several hundred. Contemporary records, medical reports, sermons, and municipal documents confirm that these people were dancing involuntarily, against their will, unable to stop, and that many of them died of exhaustion, heart failure, or stroke as a result. The city authorities, initially attempting to cure the phenomenon by providing a stage and musicians to play for the dancers in the hope they would dance the affliction out of their systems, eventually recognized this as worsening the problem and attempted to remove the afflicted to a shrine. Treatment. The dancing plague of 1518 was not an isolated event. Similar episodes are recorded in the Rhineland and the Netherlands in 1074. and elsewhere in the 14th and 15th centuries. The most plausible explanation, developed by historian John Waller, whose research on this subject is the most thorough available, is that these events were manifestations of mass psychogenic illness, collective trauma responses in populations already suffering from extreme stress, malnutrition, diseases, fear. The communities affected by the dancing plagues were communities that had experienced or were experiencing multiple overlapping catastrophes. Their bodies were expressing, in the only language available to them, a distress that the rational mind could not contain. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding what was happening. Medieval theology interpreted it through the lens of spiritual affliction. But what was happening, at its core, was the human nervous system failing under the weight of more suffering than it could bear. Part 11. What catastrophe touches? Closing reflections on survival and memory. The catastrophes of the Middle Ages were not equally distributed. They fell with disproportionate weight on the poor, the marginalized, and the already vulnerable, on the peasants who had no granary reserves when harvests failed, on the urban poor packed into tenements where plagues spread most efficiently, on the Jewish communities who served as scapegoats for inexplicable calamities, on the women and children who had the least protection. When armies moved through the countryside, the great and the powerful suffered too. No crown or castle wall kept out the plague, and hunger could reach the tables of the mighty when harvests failed long enough. They suffered less, recovered faster, and left behind more of the written words through which we understand these events. The voices of the most vulnerable are the hardest to hear across the centuries, but their silence itself is historical evidence of a kind. What changed as a result of these catastrophes is one of important questions in medieval history, and the answer is both sobering and, in some ways, surprisingly hopeful. Populations recovered slowly, incompletely, and with lasting psychological and cultural scars, but they recovered. European population did not return to its pre-Black Death levels until the 16th or 17th century, depending on the region, but it did return. Cities rebuilt, fields were replanted, institutions were reformed, sometimes because the catastrophe had destroyed the old ones so thoroughly that something new had to be created in their place. The labor shortage created by the Black Death helped undermine the economic foundations of serfdom. The failure of the Church to explain or mitigate plague contributed to the religious questioning that would eventually produce the Reformation. The fall of Constantinople and the disruption of Eastern trade routes pushed European powers toward oceanic exploration. Catastrophe, in the medieval world as in all human history, was never simply destruction. It was also always transformation. The medieval response to catastrophe was shaped by the intellectual and theological resources available to it. Disease was understood as divine punishment, or the influence of corrupted air rather than as eccrical infection. Famine was attributed to sin or to astrological influence, rather than to climatic change and agricultural failure. The explanatory frameworks were wrong in almost every technical detail, yet they served an important function. They gave suffering a meaning. They located it within a narrative that made human agency, even if only the agency of prayer and penance, relevant, and they connected individual suffering to a community of the afflicted. The flagellants were wrong about the cause of the plague and wrong about the remedy. But they were doing something that humans have always done in the face of incomprehensible suffering. They were reaching for one another, forming communities of shared pain, insisting that what was happening had a meaning and that it demanded a response. The catastrophe examined in this documentary killed, collectively, tens of millions of people. They destroyed cities, civilizations, and ways of life that had been built over generations. They left in their wake trauma, grief, and a changed world that the survivors had not chosen and had not imagined. And yet, the survivors survived. They rebuilt. They rebuilt. They remembered in chronicles and the oral traditions that lie behind them. They transmitted to their descendants across the centuries not only the memory of what had happened, but also the knowledge that it had been survived. That knowledge that the worst that the world can do is not the end of the world is perhaps the most important legacy of the medieval catastrophe. It does not minimize the suffering. It does not diminish the losses, but it insists on the extraordinary, stubborn, unreasonable persistence of the human will to continue. The Middle Ages were, among many other things, an extended and terrible proof of personess. And we are the inheritors of everyone who made it through